Hello, and welcome back to the Conversation Corner, a series by the Jerusalem Post and Ono Academic College. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Yaron Zalicha, the former Accountant General for the Israeli Finance Ministry and an economist who heads the Higher Academic Council at Ono Academic College. Yaron, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, in layman's terms, explain to us the before and after of Israel's economic status post-October 7th.
Well, Israel has witnessed at the past 17 years a slow deterioration in the state of the economy. At 2007, 2008, Israel reached its highest peak relative to the United States or the G7. In real terms, Israel GDP per capita reached 62% of the GDP per capita in the United States. That's the highest share ever. During 2003 to 2007 or 8, its growth were extremely high, and it succeeded to grow from 49% of the GDP per capita in the United States to 62. As I said, that's the highest point ever. However, since 2008 onwards, we are witnessing a slow deterioration. Before the October 7 war, we got below 50% of the GDP per capita in the United States on real terms, when you adjust to the differences in prices, including, of course, real estate. Now, this caused us several obstacles. The first obstacles regarding October 7 is that on 2007, by the way, my term was beginning of 2003, from the lowest peak of 49% to the end of 2007 till the highest peak of the 62%. Now, these years, we were able to allocate 7% of our entire GDP to defense expenses, 7% of the national income. However, since the slow deterioration over the past 17 years, the government was not able to allocate 7% anymore, and its rates deteriorated from 7 to 6.5 to 6 to 5.5, and recently, just before the war, it reached a lower peak of 5% only. Now, the difference between 7% of GDP to 5% of GDP is 40 billion shekels a year.
Wow.
40 billion shekels a year. That explains why on October 7, we were facing our enemies with a smaller army than we needed. I don't want to mention the number of divisions, including armed divisions with tanks, that were closed in these 17 years. It got published that almost half of our helicopters, fighting helicopters, were closed, and of course, many weapons were not filled in the inventories.
So I'm curious how that compares to right now. We have so many more security expenses beyond the expenses of the war. How does Israel finance this war right now?
Well, that's another problem. The second issue, following your question, is that from 2008 until 2023, the government has brilliantly, or should I say viciously, structure the economy in a way that it can takes a larger share of our income, our personal income. She got addicted to raising the real estate prices and the consumer price index. The average prices, including real estate, in 2007 were between 5 to 10% below the prices in the United States or in Western Europe. In 2023, it becomes from minus 5 to 10% plus 35%. The difference in the prices, on the one hand, decreased our real GDP per capita, and on the other hand, increased the government revenues, because every 1% that the prices go up, you have the VAT that works on the 1% and the corporate tax. So roughly, from every 1 shekel that the prices go up in the supermarket, 40 pennies goes to the government. Now, if you're talking about real estate prices, the flats prices, it becomes to 60 pennies of every pound. So the government succeeded to take a larger share of our real income in order to make the government richer and the poor and the people poorer. In order to summarize these numbers, I will say that in 2007, my last year in term, the government debt decreased from almost 100% in 2003 to 75% of national income. The private debt, the household private debt, decreased from 38% to 36%. However, from 2008 onwards until October 7, the government debt continued to decrease from 75% of GDP to 60, 15% of GDP, but the entire 15% were added to the private debt, who increased from 36% to 50%. The main vehicle to transferring the debt from the government to the citizens were the prices. They gave a big hug to the local monopolies, to the sole importers, to the banks, to the government companies, and all the unions, of course, and all the groups that contribute to the increased prices. So, in order to summarize, the state of the economy is worse even below the war. Since the government succeeded in decreasing its debt, the government debt, it has the amounts needed to finance the war. That's not the problem. The problem is that after the war, we cannot continue with the same vicious economic policy that brought us from 62% of GDP per capita in the United States to 46% or 48%. It's crazy. It has to be stopped. You know, Professor Herbert Stein, which was a very famous Republican policy economist in the 70s and 80s. He was the lead policy economist of the Republican parties and government administrations, including President Reagan. And he was sent to Israel in 1985 in order to rescue the Israeli economy from collapse in 1985. He used to say that if something cannot work forever, it must stop. Now, the question is, when would it stop? After the collapse or before the collapse? Now, the government, I'm not afraid, she can finance another war. She has a very low government debt. The problem is the citizens. The citizens are bankrupting. And of course, not only the citizens, small and medium businesses are also collapsing, although they are the main growth engine at the business sector. The entire economy is distorted and needs to be restructured.
Israel's economy, though, it recovered somewhat in the first quarter of 2024 after production dropped following October 7th. Some say that this is, pretty similar to what we've seen after the prior military conflict, kind of like what you described. Are we actually on the right track to economic recovery when it comes to specifically the drop that we saw surrounding the war?
Well, Israel economy is very stable and robust to external shocks. Because of its experience, I'm not afraid of the stability of the economy. I'm afraid on our level of income, which is deteriorated. Not the economy will collapse. The state of the citizens will collapse. We cannot finance, a young couple cannot finance a decent flat. You need 165 brute salaries to buy an average apartment. That's crazy. I'm older than you. When I was a young couple, 25 years ago, almost 30 years ago, the average flat cost 70 salaries. When I reached to the Ministry of Finance at the early 2003, it increased from 70 average salaries to 96. We changed the economic policy, started to grow fast, very fast. As I told you, from 49% of the GDP per capita in the United States to 62. In those years, the average flat decreased from 96 brute salaries to 80. If we would have continued at the same policy, in 4 or 5 years, we would have reached back the 70 salaries per apartment. However, early 2008, and more extensively after Netanyahu reached to power at March 2009, they changed the economic policy that we implemented between 2003 to 2007. And the changes in the economic policy, that's what caused us the increase in the average prices and the prices of the real estate. And these prices became our biggest obstacle in order to continue with fast growth. We have to change that. Otherwise, no young couple can have the ability to live here. That's the problem. The government will stay on. She could continue forever. But the young people cannot continue forever like that. And they shouldn't. Why should they work the hardest relative to their companions in the West and earn the lowest and pay the highest? Why?
The high-tech sector in Israel has taken a hard hit also because the high number of reservists that have currently been summoned, such a large portion of them were called in from that sector specifically, as well as due to strained international relationships because of the war. So this sector is, the engine of Israel's economy. We're the startup nation. How do we support the high-tech sector to get it out of this phase, to get through this current situation?
First of all, there is a misunderstanding regarding the high-tech sector contribution to the Israeli potential to growth. High-tech is important. However, it's not important enough to be a sole engine to the Israeli economy. 10% of the working population works in the high-tech sector. 90% works in other fields. We need to take care of them. Now, the 10% is the highest share ever in the world entirely. There's no single country that's more than 10%, not even 7% works in the high-tech sector. So we cannot expect the 10% to become 30, 40, 50. It will not happen. It is growing by 0.5% a year. So in 10 years, it can be 15%. We need to take care of the 90%. And in order to do that, we need to change the economic policy. The high-tech will keep for himself. It doesn't need the government. It doesn't need the subsidies of the government. It needs you, the young people, your brains. And fortunately, your brains are not affected by the government, for better or for worse. The problem is, should you keep your brains here, or you got depressed by the economic situation and the not ability to buy a decent flat? That's what I'm concerned of. The politician will take care of themselves. The government will take care of herself. She knows how to take money from us. That's not the problem. The problem is that they are not exercising our full potential. Now, you should bear in mind the number that I told you before. If we would have kept the 62% of the GDP per capita, like in 2007-8, not continue to grow to 70%, 80%. And I'm reminding you, at 2003, we were 49%. We could have reached by now 80%, not 48 or 46%. Now, if we would have kept the 62%, the government budget in 2023 would have been 600 billion shekels instead of 500 billion shekels. Wow. When I'm talking about missed opportunity and not fulfilling our potential, just for the government, they missed the opportunity to have another 100 billion shekels a year, just from the growth that they missed. 100 billion explain the 40 billion that are missing in the army, the 20 billion that are missing from our health services, the education, the poverty, you name it.
So what would your solution be? I'm curious regarding specifically the education sector right now, on an economic level, right? Because the education sector has been inevitably compromised by this war, and so the deficit there has been impacting that sector differently than anywhere else. What would your solution be there?
When you mean the education system, I presumably assume that you're talking about the children, not students, academic, because we are working.
Yeah, not academia.
You're talking about academia or junior schools?
No, I'm talking about junior schools, high schools, middle schools, elementary schools.
Well, you don't learn anything there. So you can go to school, not go to school, do the same. What you cannot teach children in 2024 in 40 children a class. You cannot do that. In the European Union and the United States, the maximum is 18. The maximum, 18. Now, we are covering for the unbearable crowd in the class with increasing the number of hours in school. But it doesn't work. From the first grade to the 12th grade, Israeli pupils learn, listen, this is unbelievable, 2,000 hours more than a pupil in the European Union. From first grade to 12th grade, yes?
Yes.
2,000 hours. That means around 150 hours per year, averagely. But our grades are lower and lower and lower because you can teach 10,000 hours, but the outcome in 40 pupils a class will be 0. And when you add 2,000 zeros, you keep with a 0. Now, instead of allocating the hours not to the 40 pupils a class, but to divide the classes, build new schools, and divide the classes using the same hours, you can reach much more, much better results. But you don't do that. Why you don't do that? You don't do that because you don't have the money to build the schools. So you keep on pushing more children to the same classes and compensate them with more hours every year, but at the same 40 pupils a class. How stupid can you be? Why do you think that if you do the same thing, you'll reach a different solution or a different result? We have to change our economic policy in order that the GDP will be bigger. And when you'll do that, you'll have the money to build schools and divide the classes to 18 and not 40 pupils a class.
And pay teachers a reasonable sum, I assume.
I'm sorry. The salary of the teacher is reasonable. It is the European Union average. The problem is only with the young teachers, the teachers at the first years of their career. That's the only problem. After a few years, the salary becomes reasonably comparing to European Union, at least. By the way, for the past 30 years, you more than doubled the salary, real terms, the salary of the teachers. What was the outcome in the results of the pupils? Nothing. And even if you will double the salaries again, you'll not reach anything, because at 40 pupils a class, even God himself cannot teach.
Professor Yaron Zalicha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.